As we've been progressing through these episodes, we've been analyzing the Book of Concord chronologically based on the date of the writings.
We started with Luther's catechisms, which were composed around 1529. They served as a grounding in Luther's fundamental theological perspective.
Next, we took up the incorporation of these theological fundamentals as we worked through the Augsburg Confession and the Apology, written less than a year later.
Although written by Melanchthon, Luther did not openly express disapproval of the content. We make note of that because one would be hard-pressed to claim the fundamental Lutheran theological assumptions evolved in that short of a time frame.
Simply put, both documents set the theological foundation of Luther and Melanchthon. In the next series of episodes, we're going to look at two more documents written by the same two men 7 years later, Luther's Smalcald Articles and Melanchthon's On the Power and Primacy of the Pope.
Naturally, over the passage of time, with the evolution of the political landscape as well as social forces, one might postulate that both men's theological perspectives might be modified or nuanced.
Right. In fact, as we discussed in some of our episodes on the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon's language did change, not over a long period, but in a rather short period. Recall, there are instances where what he wrote in the Augsburg Confession is different compared to what is found not much later in the Apology.
And if the language is changed there, why wouldn't we expect it to be changed later, in the midst of controversies and disputes which arose after the Diet of Augsburg?
With that history in mind, we're going to take up this issue. Did the views of the Reformers change after writing the Augsburg Confession? And specifically, because they end up being controversies addressed later on in the Formula of Concord, did Luther's views on the function and uses of the law change? And did Melanchthon's views on the office of ministry change?
To get at this question, we're going to take the next few episodes to talk about two documents that were written nearly a decade after the Diet of Augsburg.
As we dig deeper into these documents, we want you to pay attention to whether or not these documents indicate if either person changed in his core conviction on the doctrine of justification, which is rooted in the distinction between the function of the law and the gospel.
It's absolutely clear that, in regard to the role of the law in the life of the Christian, Luther did not have second thoughts or even waver.
Likewise, concerning the issue of authority, specifically the office of ministry and the establishment of the true church, Melanchthon did not reconsider his position one bit in the power and primacy of the Pope.
To substantiate this point, we're going to start with Luther, spending some time in this episode and the next episode unpacking the content of the Smalcald Articles.
In 1537, under the impression that Pope Paul III would be hosting an ecumenical council in May to address the call for reforms in the Roman Church, the Smalcald Articles, as they would come to be known, were presented to the German princes. The articles, written by Luther, served as a summary of the evangelical confession.
In his preface to the articles, Luther characterized this writing as containing the same theological underpinnings as what he had written nearly a decade earlier in the treatise titled A Confession Concerning Christ's Supper. Both documents serve as a theological last will and testament, functionally.
In fact, Luther openly stated that his motivation for writing these documents was to provide something to the public so that it would be more difficult to misrepresent his true beliefs.
The Smalcald Articles themselves are divided into three parts. The first part is brief, simply echoing the language of the creeds. The second part, however, is longer.
Luther infers that this part begins to set forth the disputes that arose between the papacy and the evangelicals. And it all starts with the first article, which Luther identifies as the chief article, justification by faith alone.
Everything the evangelicals teach, Luther says, is rooted in this article. In just a relatively few sentences, Luther asserts that we are justified by faith alone, apart from works of the law, and entirely by God alone.
This is such a critically important article of faith that Luther wrote, quote, "Nothing in this article can be conceded or given up, even if heaven and earth passed away. On this article stands all that we teach and practice against the Pope, the devil, and the world. Therefore, we must be quite certain and have no doubt about it. Otherwise, everything is lost, and the Pope and the devil and whatever opposes us will gain victory and be proved right." End quote.
And while Luther's writings may have been briefer, he is certainly echoing what Melanchthon asserted in the Apology to Article 4 of the Augsburg Confession. So there should be no question about what makes a Lutheran in the Book of Concord.
From that foundation, Luther turns his attention to the Mass. This is the very first sentence Luther wrote in this section of the Smalcald Articles. Quote, that the Mass under the papacy has to be the greatest and most terrible abomination, as it directly and violently opposes this chief article. End quote. Why would Luther be so harsh?
Well, it has to do with the Roman understanding of the Mass. Rome teaches that it is the work of the priest who performs the Mass that merits the forgiveness of sins.
Put another way, the papists teach that it is not the work of Christ taking away our sin in the Mass, but it is the work of the human being who performs the Mass that is the key. And so it is directly opposed to justification by faith alone.
In other words, rather than faith in the words of Christ speaking forgiveness to the sinner, one is directed to confirm their standing before God through the work performed by the priest in the Mass.
Luther cites Matthew 15:9 as condemning the Roman view. In vain do they worship me with human inventions. To be sure, Luther recognized that Rome could not and would not budge an inch on this article. If they were to do so, said Luther, the entire system of the papacy would fall. He knew this critical difference between justification by faith alone and the Roman understanding of the Mass could never be overcome. He put it this way, quote, thus, we are and remain eternally divided and opposed to one another, end quote.
We're going to stop here and take up Luther's discussion of the abuses and bad doctrine that flow out of Rome's erroneous understanding of the Mass. So, stay tuned for that in the next episode.